This video covers the history of voting rights in North Carolina over 200 years, from 1776 to 1977. The history of an individual's right to vote, also called suffrage or enfranchisement, is not a straight journey from restricted to expanded rights. Rather, voting rights ebbed and flowed, often in response to nationwide movements. In 1776, the first state constitution for the newly formed state of North Carolina was ratified. The basic requirements it set to vote for the state legislature were to be a free man aged 21 or older and a resident of North Carolina for 1 year prior to Election Day. To vote for the state senate, there was an additional property ownership requirement, and to vote for the state House of Commons, voters were required to have paid public taxes. There was no restriction based on skin color. In 1835, however, a constitutional convention was held to consider several amendments to the state constitution, including whether or not to restrict the voting rights of free persons of color. The amendment proposed by the convention and approved by the people in the November 1835 election stated that no free person who had at least one person of color in their ancestry, going back 4 generations, would be allowed to vote for members of the Senate or House of Commons. This amendment effectively barred people of color from voting in North Carolina until 1868. After the end of the Civil War, North Carolina established a new state constitution. Article 6 of the 1868 Constitution removed color and property barriers while retaining age and residency requirements. For the rest of the 19th century, persons of color could and did both vote and run for office in North Carolina, but leaders in the black community recognized that their suffrage was not ensured. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution declared that the right to vote could not be denied or restricted on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, by the 1890s, it was clear that lawmakers in North Carolina were ready to follow other states in enacting laws to loophole this amendment. In a speech at an event celebrating Emancipation Day in 1898, Henry P. Cheatham, the only black member of the 52nd U.S. Congress, warned that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. It took great suffering to get liberty. It requires great watchfulness to keep it. In 1901, the amendment of the North Carolina Constitution regarding suffrage was ratified, introducing measures to exclude persons of color from voting. The Grandfather Clause guaranteed suffrage to any male individual who could prove that they or their ancestor could vote on January 1, 1867. Since men of color could not vote until the 1868 Constitution was passed, this effectively ensured that only white citizens were guaranteed the right to vote. If voters were not already permanently registered under this clause, they had to demonstrate their ability to read and write in a literacy test that was often designed to trick and trip them up. While men of color were losing their rights to vote, the battle for women's suffrage began to intensify. In 1913, Gertrude Wheel formed the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association, which worked tirelessly to show that North Carolinian women wanted to vote and could participate in the democratic process. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution extending the right to vote to women aged 21 and older was ratified in 1920. North Carolina did not ratify the amendment, but it received the required number of state ratifications to make it federal law. Voting rights did not just involve age, gender, color, property ownership, or literacy levels. The method by which voters cast their ballot was not secret and so left voters at risk of intimidation and voting manipulation. This changed in 1929 with the statewide adoption of the Australian ballot or secret ballot, first developed by Australia in 1856. Secret ballots had several requirements, including that they were required to include the names of the nominated candidates of all parties, and of course that they had to be marked in secret, which required changes to polling places. Of course, secret ballots could not always be secret for some. Blind persons and those with visual impairments even today may need assistance filling out ballots. It was easy for poll workers to take advantage of blind people in early systems, but in 1931, a sweeping state law addressing corruption in primaries and elections included a section declaring it a misdemeanor to give the wrong ballot to a blind person, one of the first examples of a law addressing voting rights for people with disabilities in North Carolina. Mid-20th century, inequities in voting continued until and following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Jim Crow laws were still practiced, but not consistently applied across North Carolina. African American voters could cast ballots in some areas of the state, but were prevented in others by the Grandfather Clause and literacy test. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act authorized the federal government to assume control of the voter registration process in states and voting districts that were determined to be discriminatory. Despite this, records from Stanley County showed that as late as 1968, literacy tests were still being administered. This literacy test for Richard Randolph is one of only a few to survive. We end our journey today in the 1970s, although refinements and changes to voting laws continue to this day in North Carolina. In 1971, the 26th Amendment to the United States Constitution extended suffrage to persons 18 and older, reducing the required age for the first time since the founding of the United States. In the same year, North Carolina passed a new state constitution, removing the discriminatory amendments of 1901 and incorporating the laws passed by Congress in the 20th century. Finally, in an act that would come to be very important during the COVID-19 pandemic, the first bill allowing for statewide absentee voting in North Carolina was passed by the House of Representatives in 1977. From the first state constitution of 1776 to the allowing of absentee voting in 1977, the definition of a voter and their rights at the ballot box have evolved, expanding and contracting along the way. The records featured in this video showcase some of the biggest changes made in the first 200 years of our state's history. Many of the records referenced in this video can be viewed in their entirety in the North Carolina digital collections at digital.ncdcr.gov. Please feel free to contact us at archives@dncr.nc.gov with any questions.